I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are standing in a hallway outside, like a high school science lab.
Oh yeah, I know exactly the kind of hallway you
All
mean.
right. And you are looking at one of those classic glass cabinets charting human evolution. You know the exact image.
Oh, absolutely, the classic lineup.
Yeah, it starts on the far left with a dark, hairy, kind of stooped ape. And it progresses, step by step, getting taller, standing straighter.
Usually getting lighter in skin tone too,
Yeah,
until it arrives at the supposed pinnacle of progress, the modern human.
exactly. It is an incredibly powerful visual narrative. But what if that entire concept, like this idea of a straight, linear march from primitive simplicity to advanced civilization, is actually a dangerous illusion?
Well, it is a profound framing issue, honestly. It quietly dictates how we view the entire world.
How so?
Because that linear image conditions us to view history as a one-way street toward constant improvement. And in doing so, it makes us completely blind to the wisdom of the past. And frankly, it makes us incredibly arrogant about the massive systemic crises of our present day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that arrogance is exactly what we are challenging today. The mission for this deep dive into our source material is to completely flip the script on how we process information.
Yeah, we are looking at excerpts from Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk.
Usually when modern society interacts with indigenous knowledge, it treats it like, well, a relic in that glass cabinet, something quaint, exotic, and firmly in the past to just look at.
Right, as if it's dead history.
Exactly. But today, we are going to look at our modern global systems through an indigenous lens.
Which requires a fundamental rewiring of how we analyze reality. The source material argues that Western thought constantly isolates variables.
Like separating things from their environment.
Exactly. We take a subject, strip it of its context, and study it in a vacuum. Indigenous thought, on the other hand, is inherently high context. It focuses entirely on the intricate patterns and the invisible forces connecting all things.
And the source material starts diagnosing the sickness of our modern low-context civilization by introducing us to a troublemaker from an Aboriginal creation story.
Right, the emu.
Yeah, the emu, which is such a wild concept to start with.
Right, the emu serves as the perfect, enduring metaphor for the fundamental flaw of modern systems.
The text actually describes this flaw as a Luciferian lie, which boils down to one singular, incredibly destructive thought: I am greater than you, you are lesser than me.
Yeah, that unchecked ego.
In the dreaming story, the emu is basically a malignant narcissist. He runs around making a massive mess, constantly showing off his physical speed, demanding to be the boss of all creation.
Just aggressively shouting over everyone else.
Exactly. It got so severe that the other animals, the kangaroo, the echidna, and the great serpent, had to work together to hold him down.
And you can actually look up at the night sky and see this epic struggle immortalized in the dark shapes of the Milky Way.
Which is amazing. But, when I read that, I immediately thought of like modern internet trolls or those corporate narcissists who just weaponize social contracts.
Oh, absolutely. The emu embodies the kind of unchecked individualism that our current global systems don't just tolerate, but actively reward.
They demand the absolute right to be heard, but they refuse to listen, which completely shatters the basic reciprocity that holds any community together.
Right.
But I have to push back a little on the underlying premise here. I mean, isn't some level of individual ambition, like a little bit of emu energy, necessary for a society to progress or invent or innovate?
That's a fair question. But the text draws a very careful distinction here. The argument isn't that ambition or individuality is inherently evil.
Okay, so where's the line?
The danger arises when the system allows that ambition to sever the individual from their obligations to the whole.
Oh, I see.
In our current societal structures, the narcissist faces virtually no real boundaries. They can exploit a system, burn out a community or a company, and simply move on to the next one in the sort of Darwinian struggle.
Wow, yeah. Contrast that with traditional indigenous law. The source points out that they recognized everyone is perfectly capable of being an idiot sometimes.
Right, we all have moments of emu-like narcissism,
hmm
but the mechanism for handling it was entirely different.
Under traditional law, punishment for breaking the social balance was swift, and it was harsh, but it left no permanent criminal record.
That is the crucial mechanical difference. Once the punishment was served, the slate was genuinely clean.
Really, just like that.
Just like that. The transgressor was reintegrated fully into the community. The system was designed to correct the behavior and immediately restore the balance of the network not to permanently exile the individual.
Which makes sense because when people know they can start fresh, they are probably less likely to twist the rules to avoid accountability. They just accept the correction and return to the fold.
Exactly. It's a self-healing network.
So if unchecked emu narcissism destroys the social fabric because it views people as isolated objects to be used, it follows logically that this exact same mindset infects how we view the physical earth.
Which takes us from social contracts directly to literal stones.
Yes. Specifically, the fatal error of categorizing the world into living and dead matter.
It is a categorization that allows for endless extraction without moral consequence. If a rock is dead, you can do whatever you want to it.
This is where the source brings up the Uluru Rocks. This part blew my mind. For decades, tourists would visit the sacred site of Uluru in Australia and just take stones home as souvenirs.
Viewing them merely as pretty paperweights.
Exactly. But then, a few decades ago, park rangers started receiving these heavy packages in the mail. People were mailing the rocks back.
Often accompanied by desperate, terrified apology letters.
Yeah. They were experiencing terrible luck, severe illness, bad sleep, hauntings. It got so crazy they sent back so many rocks that a massive storage shed had to be built just to house them all.
Because to modern Western thinking, a rock is dead matter. It's an isolated variable.
But to Indigenous thinking, rocks are sentient. They hold spirit and they hold deep time memory. You cannot simply displace them without disrupting a highly connected living system.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this clash between Indigenous cosmology and Western logic comes to a head when we look at actual physics.
Right, the laws of thermodynamics. Walk us through how a sentient rock connects to thermodynamics, because this is wild.
So the author refers to Western thinkers as second peoples and points out they're essentially obsessed with the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, and that law is the one about entropy, right?
Exactly. It dictates that in a closed system, energy inevitably decays into entropy. Everything breaks down. This creates what physicists call the arrow of time, a linear path from order to chaos, from a definitive beginning to an inevitable exhausted end.
The straight line, just like that glass cabinet of evolution we talked about in the hallway.
It is the exact same linear geometry applying to the universe itself. But Indigenous law, what the author calls the first law, aligns with the first law of thermodynamics.
Which is that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it merely changes form.
Right. It moves between systems. This describes an open, interconnected system where energy is infinitely regenerated.
So time isn't a straight arrow flying toward death.
No, it is cyclical. It breathes in and out.
So if a city or, modern civilization operates on the assumption of the second law, that it is a closed system destined to decay, it is basically operating on a massive scarcity mindset.
Completely. And to stave off its own inevitable death, it demands endless economic growth.
And the only way to achieve endless growth on a finite planet is to relentlessly extract resources from the interconnected systems around it.
It turns open living systems into dead, static heaps of wealth.
Is that why infinite economic growth is fundamentally mathematically impossible under this framework?
Yes. It is a self-terminating algorithm. It forces us to treat the living world as dead matter to fuel a straight line toward a cliff.
Wow.
It cannot sustain itself because it refuses to acknowledge that it is part of a larger regenerative cycle.
Okay, so to stop driving toward that cliff, the text argues we have to fundamentally rewire the hardware of our brains. We have to move from Western reductionism, which studies things in isolation, back to Indigenous high-context thinking.
And the author uses a brilliant physical metaphor for this, the human hand.
Yes. Let's do this. I want you to look at your hand right now as we walk through this. First, the pinky finger. This is kinship mind.
This is the foundational understanding that nothing exists outside of a relationship. Knowledge isn't stored in a vacuum. It lives in the dynamic connections between people and places.
Next, the ring finger. Story mind. And this isn't just about telling fairy tales around a fire, is it?
No, not at all. Even memory champions today use narrative to memorize thousands of digits of pi because our brains are biologically wired to retain narrative, not isolated data points. Narrative is the ultimate memory tool.
Then the middle finger. Dreaming mind. This is the use of physical metaphors like dances, carved objects, or even this hand gesture we are doing right now.
Right. It bridges the abstract world of complex ideas with the physical world of reality.
The index finger is ancestor mind. This refers to the deep, trance-like engagement and fierce concentration you see in young children playing, or in intense cultural practices.
It is a peak neurological flow state for absorbing information.
And finally, the thumb. Pattern mind. The thumb is unique because it can physically touch all the other finger.
Exactly. Pattern mind is the ability to synthesize the other four minds, to see the whole system, the massive trends, and the invisible forces connecting all the nodes.
This represents the pinnacle of high-context reasoning.
Print-based cultures tend to be inherently low context. They focus on ideas, words, and objects entirely independently of their environment.
While high-context cultures understand that you cannot comprehend a part without understanding the whole it belongs to.
Exactly.
But, the author goes surprisingly hard on print culture here. He brings up a professionally printed sign he saw that read, "Strictly no running," strictly spelled Strickly.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
He jokes about getting enraged over misplaced apostrophes on grocery store signs. But more seriously, he references Plato's famous warning that the invention of writing would eventually destroy human memory.
Right.
Are we saying literacy is actually bad for us? Because, we are literally reading a printed book to learn this.
It is about recognizing a severe cognitive trade-off. The author is not anti-literacy. As you noted, he wrote a book to communicate these ideas globally.
Right.
However, relying solely on print and low-context thinking physically rewires the neural pathways of the brain to process information linearly and isolate variables.
So we lose that high context ability.
Exactly. Indigenous knowledge, utilizing those five minds, functions as a biological peer-to-peer network. When knowledge lives dynamically in the relationships between people and their environment, it creates a robust, decentralized cognitive backup drive.
I see.
If a dictator burns down the central library, the knowledge survives in the community. If a society relies only on the library, it is entirely vulnerable to totalitarian erasure.
That makes total sense. But if humans are biologically wired for this brilliant high-context pattern thinking, if we are literally born with this ancestor mind genius, how did we lose it?
Well, the author suggests it wasn't an evolutionary accident. It is the direct result of how our modern societies were intentionally designed.
Which takes us to the 19th century Prussian experiment.
Yes. After a humiliating military defeat by Napoleon in 1806, Prussia recognized they needed a completely different kind of population. So they invented universal public schooling.
And the goal wasn't to create enlightened, free-thinking philosophers who could use pattern mind, was it?
Not even close. The explicit goal, according to the source material, was to manufacture compliant soldiers who would follow orders without question and obedient factory workers who could tolerate monotonous tasks.
The text points out that the system was modeled directly on the principles of animal domestication.
It really was. To domesticate an animal, you separate the young from their parents during daylight hours. You confine them in enclosed spaces with limited natural stimulation.
And you use arbitrary rewards and punishments to force compliance with purposeless tasks, which sounds exactly like a modern school bell ringing to move kids from one windowless room to another.
It's a very striking parallel.
But I have to push back here because this sounds like a massive conspiracy theory. Is the author genuinely claiming that our entire modern education system is a deliberate smoky room plot to lobotomize the population?
This raises an important question. It is less about a grand conspiracy and more about analyzing the historical mechanisms of systems. The author presents this narrative to demonstrate how grand, unquestioned ideals like educational progress often serve as delivery systems for control. And the core takeaway the author is driving at is biological, not just political.
Biological? How so?
Forcing children into rigid, low-context, highly controlled environments actually starves the brain of the specific stimuli it needs to develop.
Oh, we're talking about the nucleus basalis, right?
Yes, exactly.
Explain how a classroom actually degrades the brain, because this was fascinating.
The nucleus basalis is the area of the brain responsible for the effortless, hyper-focused learning we see in toddlers. That ancestor mind flow state.
Right.
It requires novel, high-stakes, multi-sensory physical interaction like navigating a complex forest or tracking an animal to trigger the release of acetylcholine, which locks in learning.
And in a classroom?
When a child is confined to a desk staring at a two-dimensional piece of paper, that biological trigger is starved. The nucleus basalis literally falls into disuse and decays. The system schools the natural ancestral genius right out of them to make them manageable.
So we are effectively domesticating ourselves. We are putting ourselves into an artificial state of permanent adolescence where we sit quietly and wait for instructions from a boss or a politician.
That's the argument, yes.
But if our schools and our corporate structures are designed for top-down control and absolute compliance, how on earth do we organize ourselves to solve the massive, complex crises we are facing today? I mean, a top-down command and control approach clearly isn't working for climate collapse or economic instability.
The source insists that sustainable solutions cannot be programmed from the top down by a single visionary leader. They must emerge organically from decentralized networks.
And this brings us to the indigenous methodology of yarning.
Right.
Now, yarning is not just a casual chat around a campfire. The text describes it as a highly rigorous process of overlapping dialogue, consensus building, and shared narrative.
And crucially, there is no single boss directing the flow of conversation.
People build on each other's points, mapping out relationships, and finding unexpected connections between incredibly diverse sets of data.
It is an ancient cultural practice that perfectly mirrors the most advanced concepts in modern computer science and complexity theory.
So, what does this all mean? How does an ancient campfire practice apply to managing global logistics or digital networks?
Well, think about traffic roundabouts versus traffic lights.
Oh, that's a great analogy. A traffic light is top-down control, a central computer telling you exactly when to stop and when to go.
And it works fine until the power goes out or traffic gets too heavy, and then it leads to massive gridlocked failure.
But a roundabout is pattern mined. It doesn't have a boss. It gives drivers a few basic rules: yield to the right, keep moving forward, and the traffic self-organizes flawlessly, adapting to chaos without needing a dictator.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize what computer scientists call boids.
Boids.
Yeah, boids are digital simulated flocking birds on a screen. If a programmer tries to choreograph a complex, sustainable ballet of hundreds of digital birds from a central command, the system is too rigid. One small error, and the whole flock crashes.
Makes sense.
But with boids, you don't program the flock. You give each autonomous bird just 3 or 4 basic protocols. Match the speed of the bird next to you, move slightly randomly, and avoid collisions.
And then you just let them interact.
Exactly. From those simple, localized rules, breathtakingly complex, sustainable patterns emerge entirely on their own.
So you cannot control a complex system from the outside. You have to let it self-organize from within.
In human terms, if we want to build sustainable societal systems, we must act as what chaos theory calls strange attractors. We cannot operate as emu-like dictators.
So what are our protocols then?
According to the text, our basic protocol should be connect, diversify, interact, and adapt. You maintain your unique identity, you form pairs and networks, you transfer knowledge constantly, and you allow yourself to be transformed by those interactions.
You aren't trying to control the nodes. You are feeding the relationships between the nodes.
Exactly. That is the only way an open system can infinitely regenerate, which brings us right back to that first law of thermodynamics.
Man, this has been a complete paradigm shift. We started by looking at that imaginary glass cabinet in the school hallway. The illusion that humanity is walking a straight, unquestionable line of upward progress.
Right.
But by unpacking this text, we've seen how the unchecked narcissism of the emu destroys the reciprocity required for survival. We saw how treating the Earth as a closed system of dead matter dooms us to an economy of infinite extraction.
We looked at our own hands to remember the 5 minds.
Yeah, and realized how relying on low-context logic and Prussian-style education literally starves our brain's ancestral genius. And finally, we saw that abandoning top-down control in favor of decentralized self-organizing networks, whether through yarning or digital boids, is the only viable way to navigate chaos.
The author defines modern civilization not as the peak of human achievement, but specifically as city-building cultures that consume their surroundings until they inevitably collapse.
So civilization, in this view, is ultimately just a dangerous adolescent phase of humanity, which leaves us with a final, lingering concept for you to explore on your own.
If the systems around us are trapped in this adolescent delusion of supremacy, what does your personal coming of age look like? I want you to look around your room or your office right now. Look at the objects, the technologies, or even the people around you.
What are you currently treating purely as dead matter?
What are you treating as an isolated variable that exists only for you to extract value from?
And if you woke up tomorrow and applied kinship mind to your daily routine, if you truly treated your immediate environment as a sentient, interconnected network that you are a custodian of rather than a resource you are entitled to consume, what is the very first thing you would have to change?